Welcome to my spoiler review of the 1987 or 1988, different sources say different things, video game Super Thunder Blade. This was a game I really loved. I would imagine the game is probably rated ages 10 and up or something along those lines. So will this video be. So this is going to be a little unusual one because turns out I should have played this before Space Harrier 2. Because Space Harrier 2, if I understand correctly, Space Harrier 2 came after. And certainly, I would say, in almost every way, that game is better than this one. And I was very happy with how thorough I was in my video on that game. So, yeah, usually for these emulated games, arcade style games, I say, hey, watch my Space Harrier 2 video if you want my sort of general overall thoughts on the entire genre and subgenre. This time, yeah, the entire video, not just the first part, and this video is just going to be me talking about the areas where these two are different from one another. Right, and I play this on PC with Steam through the SEGA Genesis / Mega Drive collection. Wait, what's it called? Okay, yeah, it's something like that. The more important part is that right now, I believe you cannot buy it, but hopefully, if these videos help increase interest, maybe it'll be put back on those of us who were fortunate enough to be able to buy it before it was removed from the Steam store can still play these. And yeah, so basically this is Space Harrier 2, but if you have access to both of these games and you prefer like American military kind of thing to, in which case, I guess the best video to recommend is the fairly recent Dan Olsen YouTube video, This Is How You Get Jarhead Sequels, which explores the fascination with military culture in America and other Western countries. But yeah, if you prefer military stuff to this kind of, sci-fi with perhaps some fantasy, yeah, choose this one, but otherwise just go straight to Space Harrier 2. I would probably have liked this better if I played it first, and that's not the game's fault, and I'm really trying to not make it, worse than this video, but for sure, yeah, it's these games were made at a time when it could be difficult to give a game 100% unique, like tech-wise, so much was happening that it was easy to top, perhaps not immediately. Where, today you can do so much with video games that, yeah, you can do something that they'll never be able to do exactly as well. So basically you are flying this, attack helicopter, aka I guess one of the two jokes the transphobes have written and think is incredibly funny, even though it like falls apart if you know one thing about trans people. And yeah, you are shooting various military, and that's one of the biggest areas where this feels like it comes up short compared to Space Harrier 2. Basically, in my video on that, I go over the settings and some of the enemy designs and such. And in this, it is basically, you're flying through like a city, so there's like tall buildings that you have to avoid hitting. There's this I guess like desert area, and that was one of the places where it really felt like that. At first I thought this might have come after Space Harrier 2 and they like lost the rights, or I don't know, something. But in Space Harrier 2, I thought the columns in some of the areas worked because it's like alien planet, doesn't have to make sense. But here, some of the columns that are placed, it's like, okay, so you just needed a visual, something for the player to avoid crashing into. And I mean, I do feel bad. Clearly a lot of work was put into this, and it is very fun to play. But yeah, other than that, sometimes you'll fly over water, and there is at least one, what are those called again? This aircraft carrier. And that I will say, the aircraft carrier, it was, having played Raptor Call of the Shadows, it felt a tiny bit, it felt like a prototype for that, and that's fair. That was one of the places where, from what I recall, there was not something quite like that in Space Harrier 2. So that's at least cool. And that is the only place where you use, I guess, the B button. Like normally you just use the A button and then the arrow keys, or joystick or whatever. But yeah, A button to fire, and the what's it called? Yeah, thankfully you can like do continuous fire. That was one thing. That was something you actually had to enable in the menu in Space Harrier 2. So I guess some people played this and were like, I wish you couldn't just hold down the button. But yeah. But the for the see, that's the thing. I have to be careful not to call it a helicraft carrier, helicarrier, because I watch so much Marvel. But the aircraft carrier is where you also use the B button, and I do not know enough about aviation to give it the right term, but the thing you do is basically tilt your helicopter slightly downwards, and this enables you to back up a tiny bit, because this is, like Space Harrier 2, a game where you don't actually control, like you move where you're flying on the screen, but you're not controlling how fast you're going, officer, nor do you like what's the word? The right. You also cannot like back up or other than this tilt thing. But yeah, the you have to use that carefully in order to be able to hit some of the targets, and essentially beating this and getting a high score is how you show off. There's not really anything else, which is not a criticism, just statement of fact, neutral observation. That was, again, common to games from back then, and we were happy with it. I remember being a kid. I'm not quite old enough to have played this when it first came out, but yeah, I remember games where we were just like, yes, I beat that other guy's high score. I increased my own high score by just a tiny little bit, But I think so the enemy design, that's, so I've already said, it is not quite as like memorable as Space Harrier 2. Basically, it is military vehicles, and the vast majority of them are ones that we had at the time, and like you could see in a contemporary action movie if it was enough about military. And I think that is part of the goal here, that they wanted you to be able to play through one of those action movies, and that is an admirable one. I really do want to underline, I love when video games do, like, I remember realizing, wait a second, these characters in like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, they're from movies, aren't they? You can play as Bruce Lee. That's awesome. I love that. But that is basically, and I will say, I think they did a decent job of, some of them fly, some of them, they fly now. Some of them are helicopters like yourself, some are like fighter jets. There's also tanks, those are primarily on the ground. And some of the stuff with the aircraft carrier does feel slightly sci-fi. They do that thing where I'm a real mark for, but basically, like a slit will open and like this round thing will start firing. Just, yeah, it's so like it does not reflect reality, but it's wonderful. Right, and one thing where this is also distinct from reality is that they, basically shoot like fireballs, but those are very easy to read visually, and you are spending a lot of this game dodging them, so that's very important. I don't think there was even a one time where I couldn't tell if I was supposed to shoot something or move out of the way of it. One quirk of this that is also different in Space Harrier 2, and personally I prefer Space Harrier 2, but I appreciate why, basically if you get too close to the ground, you will accidentally land, and that by itself is like, okay, yeah, fair enough. But then you explode. Like, I'm not talking about if you're hit. I mean, you land and like it'll blink on the screen saying like take off or something like that. If you don't do that basically immediately, like I'm not sure you get even a full second to. Yeah, maybe you do, but very very little time certainly. You just crash. You explode. See, that's the thing. I think if they were gonna do that, I think it shouldn't have been that you land and then explode. I think it should have been if you get too close at these speeds, you're gonna crash. And I don't know if it was maybe like there was a parent who was terrified, or someone working in the industry who thought a parent might be terrified that their little kid would I don't know, maybe get ideas like start wanting to purposefully crash military vehicles. I don't know, but the yeah, I think because in Space Harrier 2 you can just go to the very bottom of the screen and just stay there. Let's see, I think it's maybe yeah. One thing is in both of these games, if you can try to stay in the very center, because that gives you the most range of movement for the dodging of both projectiles and structures. So, you are cutting off the lower part of your movement freedom if you are remaining on the ground. And I do also appreciate it makes more sense because it's a humanoid alien you play as in that one. But I think, yeah, there's just enough different enemies to sustain. It's not a super long game once you know what to do, and yeah, I've gone over that in the Space Area 2 video, because in general, a lot of these arcade games, once you know what to do, you can go through it fairly quickly. It's the getting to that point that it takes that takes time. And I think that does, yeah, the at least some of the levels will open with the helicopter sort of starting to take off, which it's not the most exciting thing, but okay, we're headed into enemy territory. This is going to be there's going to be intense action now. And so for that, it works as increasing tension, and it also gives you just like, I don't know, maybe a minute to breathe. And yeah, the graphics, genuinely, it is really cool seeing all these, like, obviously considering when it came out and how it plays and such, it does not look amazing. It's what I especially focus on is that, yeah, it's really cool games. I mean, I remember, when I was a kid, I did think, military vehicles were just the coolest thing, And then I grew up. Now it's dinosaurs. But the yeah, it is very cool. Flying around a military vehicle, blasting away these enemy military vehicles. Right? This is also a game that does not tell you what you are doing. I know I could have looked it up, but I didn't. I have no idea who you are fighting as, which, just keep in mind, technically that is said in Space Harrier 2. It's not like no games around this time did that. But yeah, it is legible. There are times where, I suppose it's basically you have to get used to how fast it moves and how quickly you have to change direction to change places to get away from stuff you'd otherwise crash into. And there were definitely times where I was like, really? I didn't make that? Some of the hitboxes are maybe a tiny bit off, but you get used to it, and there is rewind, which technically doesn't mean that you can just easily, you still have there. If you struggle with this kind of gameplay, there's still going to be parts where you just keep dying and you have to rewind a bunch of times, And yeah, the audio is great, nice, crunchy explosions. This is a very explosion-heavy game. The only thing you do to enemies is shoot them with powerful weaponry and make them explode. And yeah, you also only have the one type of projectile attack, and it does not upgrade over the course of it or any some such. The music is great, very tense. And yeah, it provides a good challenge even today, even with Rewind. And also keep in mind, if you are a purist, no one's forcing you to use Rewind. It is simply not something that, if you want, if you, hypothetically, let's say you play it without Rewind, you get to the very, very end, and you die right before beating the game, you have the option to rewind, but you could also choose not to. If you want to start over and do the entire thing in one sitting, no one's stopping you other than this game being removed from the Steam store. And I think that does pretty much. Let's see. Yeah, I did not run into any bugs or glitches. And I think that does pretty much cover it. Let's see, there was at least one more thing I want to note. So, perhaps it is unfair to even say this, because of the plus 50, there's only, I think it's like 8 or 9. One of them, I am not sure if it's being showed twice or if those are two separate games, but yeah. In the, I don't know, 1-2 minute intro to the aforementioned, Sega Mega Drive, Sega Genesis / Mega Drive collection, once again, I'm unsure if the word collection is right, but the rest of that, and once again, you can't buy it right now, so it's, anyway, 8 or 9 games in that intro are shown in that intro, and then another one when it goes to the menu screen. None of them are this one. One of them is Space Harrier 2, and when I first watched that, Space Harrier 2 was one of the ones that really grabbed my attention. And I don't know, I suppose this probably would have as well, but I think it makes a lot of sense that they went with that one instead. Yeah, I think that does cover everything. So yeah, if you have access to this game, it is a really fun time if you like this sort of gameplay. But if you're, if you have access to both this and Space Harrier 2, and you only feel like playing one of them, maybe you have a certain threshold for this game. It's definitely not for everyone, and, I would be lying if I claimed I was never frustrated with the hitbox thing. I think I may have said this in Space Harrier 2 video as well, but if, possibly not, and just in case, and also it bears repeating, I do think one of the, something that especially is annoying about these two is sometimes you can fly over a thing. But it can be really difficult to tell because sometimes it looks like you're seeing the top of it, but you're just not quite allowed to fly over it, even though it looks like you could, and maybe there's other places where you could. And I think it might be, it's possible that it is purposeful, because I know back then games, I can never remember the exact detail, but there was something about either renting or buying games where you could get a full refund if you brought the game back within, was it 3 days? So they needed you to, play the same game throughout the entire weekend to avoid having to give you the full refund, and thus they made, some of these games, possibly all these games, there would be like little hidden things that would make it especially difficult. Some of us still remember the last level of the first Rayman. But yeah, I think that does cover. So yeah, overall, this is definitely a strong 7 enemy military vehicles, you know, blown away by American military, even though, if you don't like go above and beyond, you won't know exactly why that is being done, which I do appreciate the realism of. I mean, that is how American foreign policy has been working for some time now.